When I was growing up in my United Church of Christ church in upstate New York, the same denomination as this church, we had communion once a month, just like we do here. And we had white bread cut into little tiny, seemingly perfectly square cubes, kind of like we do here, but it wasn't gluten-free. And we had tiny cups, just like we do here, but there, when you got the tray of the little cups, the inside circle had white grape juice, and the outside rings had red wine. Now, every time we have communion, there's something slightly different, and I want to share a little bit from this book called Do This, Communion for Just and Courageous Living, and this is a reflection by Mary Ludy, and she says this: years ago, a member of my congregation sidled up to me after communion and cracked, "The service was great, but the portions were small." I laughed, and then I didn't. So let me ask, what's up with those equal-sized portions, little cubes of pre-cut bread, precisely measured thimblefuls of juice in identical tiny cups? What's up with the strict communion parity, exactly this much and no more for anyone else? Why couldn't communion be more like a homemade meal at the family table where you can eat according to your hunger, according to your delight, just as much as you want to eat? It's a good question. When I was in college, I went to a communion service with my friend Eleni, and she was raised in the Greek Orthodox tradition. And I joined her for worship that day, and I was not certain if I was allowed to go to communion, because I knew that there are some traditions that if you weren't part of the church, you weren't allowed to be at the communion table. So I kind of looked to her and was like, can I go? Can I go? And she was like, yes, come on. So then I got in the line, and I do what every good visitor at church does, and I was paying very close attention to what are the rules? How do I do this? What's happening? I couldn't quite see, so I got to the front of the line, and it was a hunk of bread. So growing up with my little bite-sized piece of bread, I took my little bite-sized piece of bread, and Eleni whispers to me, she says, "Take more." And I looked at her and I said, "What?" She said, "Take more." And I noticed that the people in front of me had a hunk of bread. And I was like, oh dear, what am I going to do with that? So I took the hunk, and then I was like, now what? Because I'm supposed to drink from the cup next. So I watched, and somebody took a bite and then took a sip. I was like, all right. But then I had this hunk of bread, and I noticed everyone had taken their hunk of bread back to their pew to keep eating. And she said to me later, she said, "This is a feast. You are supposed to be fed." Well, that's an idea. Let's see what else Mary has to say. St. Paul says that the Lord's table, no one should drink too much and get drunk, or eat too little and starve. But that doesn't mean that everyone needs to be served the same precisely pre-measured portions, which, in case you hadn't noticed, always tends to be small. Now, of course, Jesus can convey his loving presence to us by any means, including pristine half-inch square bread cubes. His life will come to us abundantly, even in a small shot glass. That's nothing for him. He does it all the time. And sometimes, like during a pandemic, we have no choice but to use mass-produced, pre-portioned containers, holy Keurig cups. It's necessary, the safe, prudent, and loving thing to do. So there are lots of different ways we can take communion, but when we gather at this table, no matter how communion is served, we bring with us an attitude of abundance. This is a feast, and there is plenty. And really, whenever we gather at any table, we bring an attitude of welcome, an attitude of abundance. about a potluck. When you're invited to a potluck meal, you bring a dish to share. We also know that sometimes people didn't read their e-news and they didn't know there was a potluck, and there is plenty. You can still come and feast. Or perhaps you don't have anything in the pantry to bring, and that is okay, because there is going to be an abundance because others bring more than enough. Friends, we have this kind of community, a community where portions are generous. Even when we have the little squares of communion, our delicious gluten-free bread, it reminds us that everyone is welcome. The same is true with our offering. When we offer what we can, we know that some of us can give a lot and other of us can give little. When we give of our time, we know that some of us have lots of time and others of us have a little time. But when we all do what we can, when we approach our offering with a sense of sharing from our abundance, then we can remember that there is plenty. There is plenty of food to go around, especially when we share. There is plenty of resources to go around, especially when we share. And with that plenty, we can do what God is calling us to do. So we are invited to bring a mindset of generosity and not scarcity. We don't need to hoard what we have. We don't need to worry that we're going to run out. We need to trust God. Trust that what God calls us to do, God will help us have enough to accomplish. Thanks be to God. Amen.